Picture this. You're a soldier in 1258, and you've just watched your enemy stack 40,000 human skulls into a pyramid outside the walls of your own city. Not as an accident, not as a byproduct of battle, as a message, a warning sign made entirely out of people who lost. That's not a horror movie. That's Tuesday in ancient warfare. And today we're going deep into the darkest, most stomach-turning war crimes committed by ancient humans, long before the word war crime even existed. Because here's the thing, just because there was no rule book back then doesn't mean people didn't know they were doing something monstrous. They knew, they just didn't care. So buckle up, because this is going to get bleak, it's going to get bizarre, and by the end, you might actually feel a little better about living in the 21st century. Let's start in Mesopotamia, because honestly, the Assyrians basically invented psychological warfare as a brand. Somewhere around 900 BCE, the Assyrian Empire figured out something horrifying: terror is cheaper than an army. Instead of just conquering cities, they wanted cities to surrender before a single arrow was fired. So they got creative. Assyrian kings would flay captured leaders alive and then nail their skin to the city walls like some kind of nightmare billboard. They impaled prisoners on stakes outside city gates, lining the roads with bodies so that anyone approaching would see exactly what happens if you resist. Think of it like the ancient version of a ransomware pop-up, except instead of locking your computer, they're locking your entire population in a state of permanent, screaming fear. And here's the part that makes it even darker. This wasn't a side effect of war. This was the strategy. Assyrian kings literally had scribes write down their atrocities in painstaking detail and carve them into palace walls as propaganda. They wanted people to know. Imagine bragging about war crimes the same way someone brags about their gym gains on Instagram. That's the energy we're dealing with here. Now let's hop over to ancient Greece for a second, because you'd think the birthplace of democracy and philosophy would be a little more, I don't know, civilized. Nope, enter Sparta. You've probably heard of the 300. The buff dudes with the abs and the red capes. What you might not know is that Spartan society ran on a system called the crypteia, which was essentially a state-sanctioned death squad aimed at their own slave population, known as the helots. Young Spartan men would be sent out into the countryside at night with nothing but a knife, and their job: hunt down and murder any helot they came across. No trial, no warning. Just disappear into the dark and kill people who hadn't done anything except exist in the wrong social class. This wasn't a rogue unit either. This was literally part of Spartan education. Imagine if part of your high school curriculum was go murder someone from a lower income bracket, extra credit if you do it quietly. Speaking of things that get worse the more you learn, let's talk about the Mongols, because if the Assyrians invented psychological warfare, Genghis Khan and his descendants perfected it into an art form so terrifying that entire regions still carry the scars today. When the Mongol army besieged the Persian city of Nishapur in 1221, the local governor made a fatal mistake. He killed the son-in-law of Genghis Khan during the fighting. So when the city eventually fell, the response wasn't just conquest, it was near total annihilation. Historical accounts describe the Mongols ordering the systematic killing of the population, reportedly even the cats and dogs, and then piling human skulls into pyramids as a monument to what happens when you cross the wrong guy. And get this, some accounts claim Genghis Khan's own daughter oversaw part of the massacre because her husband had been killed. Revenge, but make it geopolitical and genocidal. But wait, it gets even crazier, because the Mongols didn't stop at swords and arrows. During certain sieges, they allegedly used early biological warfare, catapulting diseased corpses over city walls to spread plague among the defenders. Think about that for a second. Thousands of years before we had a name for germ warfare, someone looked at a rotting body and thought, you know what would really ruin their day? Throwing this at them. It's the ancient equivalent of weaponizing a computer virus, except instead of crashing your hard drive, it's crashing an entire city's immune system. Now let's zoom over to Rome, because if there's one empire famous for turning cruelty into a spectator sport, it's this one. After the Third Punic War in 146 BCE, Rome didn't just defeat Carthage, they erased it. The city was burned to the ground over the course of several days. The population was slaughtered or enslaved. And according to popular legend, the Romans salted the earth so nothing could grow there again. Now historians actually debate whether the salting part is myth or fact. But here's the thing, the fact that people believed Rome was capable of doing that tells you everything you need to know about their reputation. This was scorched earth warfare in the most literal sense, a civilization so thoroughly wiped from history that Carthaginian peace became a phrase used to describe total merciless annihilation of an enemy. Imagine losing an argument so badly that people use your defeat as a metaphor for total destruction for the next 2,000 years. Brutal. And let's not skip over the gladiatorial game, because while we often think of them as sport, war captives were regularly forced into these arenas as literal entertainment, fighting to the death for the amusement of a crowd eating snacks and placing bets. Prisoners of war quite literally turned into content. It's like if after a modern conflict ended, we forced the losing side to fight each other on live television for ratings. Which, let's be honest, some networks would probably do if they legally could. Now let's swing over to the Americas, because ancient atrocities weren't confined to one continent. The Aztec Empire practiced a brutal form of ritual warfare known as the Flower War, where conflicts with neighboring city-states were deliberately staged not to kill enemy soldiers outright, but to capture them alive for a much darker purpose: mass human sacrifice. Captives would be marched to the top of temples and have their hearts cut out, sometimes thousands in a single ceremony, all in the name of appeasing the god and keeping the sun rising. From a purely tactical standpoint, some historians argue this was almost more terrifying than a quick death in battle, because you knew exactly what was coming, and there was an entire elaborate religious spectacle built around your suffering. Meanwhile, up in Scandinavia, we've got the Viking, who allegedly practiced a ritual called the Blood Eagle, where a defeated enemy's ribs were supposedly cut open and their lungs pulled out and spread like wings while they were still alive. Now, historians genuinely argue about whether this actually happened or was just brutal. Saga storytelling meant to intimidate, but even if it's partly myth, the fact that Viking society told these stories about themselves and that outsiders believed them tells you exactly the kind of reputation they wanted to have. Basically, ancient marketing, except the product being sold was pure terror. Okay, quick pause, because I know we've been in a nonstop spiral of misery for a while now. So here's a weird little palate cleanser. Remember the Dharma Yuddha rules we might have touched on before? The ancient Indian code of honorable warfare that said you couldn't attack unarmed people or fight after sunset? Yeah, well, plenty of ancient Indian battles completely ignored that. The Mahabharata itself, one of the foundational epics of Indian culture, describes a war where warriors broke basically every single one of those sacred rules within the story. Ambushing at night, killing unarmed opponents, tricking enemies into lowering their weapons. It's almost like ancient humans wrote down the rules of honorable war specifically because they knew, deep down, that people were going to break them constantly. Kind of like writing, "Please don't reply all" in a work email thread that you already know is doomed. And speaking of rules getting shredded, let's talk about biblical warfare for a second, because certain ancient texts describe entire population groups being commanded into complete destruction. Cities where every man, woman, and child were to be eliminated without exception. Whether you view these accounts as literal history or religious narrative, the fact remains ancient societies across multiple continents and cultures were not just okay with total civilian annihilation. They sometimes framed it as divinely mandated, which is a genuinely terrifying thought. That the worst atrocities weren't always committed by villains twirling mustaches, but by people who fully believed they were doing the righteous thing. Now here's where it gets even wilder, because a common thread ties almost all of these ancient atrocities together, and it's not just cruelty for cruelty's sake, it's the deliberate use of fear as a weapon more powerful than any sword. The Assyrians wanted you terrified before battle even started. The Mongols wanted your descendants terrified centuries later. Rome wanted your defeat to become mythology. These weren't just wars, they were extended multi-generational psychological operations designed to make submission feel safer than resistance. And in a horrifying way, it worked. Entire regions surrendered without a fight simply because word had spread about what happened to the last city that didn't. But here's the question that should really keep you up at night. If none of this was against any written law, does that make it less of a crime? Or does it just mean humanity had to survive thousands of years of this exact behavior before we collectively said, all right, we need to write some actual rules down? Because remember, the concept of a formal war crime didn't exist until the 1800s. Everything we just talked about, the flaying, the skull pyramids, the ritual sacrifices, the blood eagles, happened in a world with zero international consequence. No tribunal, no accountability, just raw, unfiltered human brutality, dressed up sometimes as religion, sometimes as strategy, sometimes as pure entertainment. And honestly, that's what makes ancient war crimes so much darker than modern ones in a weird way. Today, when a war crime happens, at least there's a chance, however slim, of consequences, tribunals, international outrage, historical accountability. Back then, there was none of that. The only law was whoever had the bigger army and the higher tolerance for horror, which really makes you appreciate, even with all its flaws, that our current world at least tries to draw a line somewhere. So next time you hear someone romanticize the ancient world, the glory of Rome, the honor of Sparta, the majesty of the Mongol Empire, just remember what actually happened behind the marble statues and epic poems. Remember the skulls stacked outside Nishapur. Remember the skin nailed to a Syrian wall. Remember that the good old days were often built on some of the worst atrocities imaginable. Atrocities so extreme that they eventually forced humanity to sit down and ask, hey, maybe we should write some rules about this. And that right there is exactly how the modern concept of a war crime was born, out of centuries of humans discovering exactly how dark they were capable of getting and finally deciding enough is enough.